Alors, dans ces jours où nous nous sommes réunis tous ici, je regarde la salle, à ce moment même qu'on se parle, ici même, des femmes et des filles autochtones peinent de trouver justice. En Palestine, un génocide en cours. Au Liban, plus que 1 million de personnes qui sont forcément déplacées à cause d'une nouvelle invasion israélienne. Une famine forcée au Yémen, au Congo, au Soudan. Ce n'est que pour nommer quelques-uns. Mais à ce même moment, nous sommes réunis ici dans cette salle, puis je regarde, on est à peu près plus que 350 personnes. Et au même moment, à Trois-Rivières, il y a des gens, comme vous ici, réunis ensemble, un événement qui est organisé par le comité de solidarité de Trois-Rivières et le central syndical local ici, pour faire ce même lancement. Alors, oui, nous sommes là pour parler de ce monde dans lequel nous vivons, des politiques fascistes, mais nous sommes là aussi pour épouser l'espoir, pour dire que nous sommes là pour agir. À ce lancement de la Mosaïque, on se retrouve ensemble avec différentes idéologies, différentes identités, différents parcours, différentes expériences, avec des approches différentes, avec j'allais dire des points-virgules pour chaque phrase qui peuvent amener des divergences d'opinion. Mais on sait qu'on a un seul objectif, celui de contrer l'emprise du fascisme, car nous sommes au-delà de la montée du fascisme. Nous ne parlons plus de la montée, nous parlons des politiques que nous vivons. Et comme on dit, nous sommes dans the belly of the beast, dans le ventre de la bête. Ce n'est pas très sexy ni attrayant, puis ça va gâcher notre saison estivale, mais nous avons des politiques d'État bien emballées, bien camouflées, pour museler les travailleuses et travailleurs et les syndicats, pour étouffer le communautaire, pour opprimer les étudiantes et les étudiants, pour criminaliser la solidarité des peuples. Le fascisme est déjà parmi nous. Encore il n'y a même pas un mois, une parlementaire européenne, que je nommerai pas, s'est faite refuser l'entrée au Canada à cause de ses idées. Des femmes québécoises se font imposer des lois qui légifèrent ce qu'elles peuvent et ne peuvent pas porter. C'est le temps de reconnaître que nous avons le même adversaire. L'inaction, ce n'est plus la complicité. C'est une action directe qui soutient les politiques fascistes. Les agendas de beaucoup des organismes qui ont participé, je vais juste vous en nommer quelques-uns, à la naissance de cette mosaïque, dont l'Alliance ouvrière, la Ligue des droits et des libertés, le FRAPRU, l'Observatoire pour les justices migrantes, la FTQ, Multitude, la CSN, Collectif des femmes pour la Palestine, Mouvement de jeunesse palestinien, la MEPAC, l'Association nationale des partisans antifascistes italiens, Alternative, le Mouvement de solidarité nationale contre le fascisme, ne sommes que quelques-uns. Leurs agendas sont déjà remplis d'activités pour mettre sur la place publique la riposte sociale. C'est ça la mosaïque. C'est le constat que c'est notre impératif d'agir, de s'allier à cette lutte déjà entreprise par le Sud global et de construire une mosaïque de résistance. Je vous remercie, puis je vais céder la parole à Judith.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Pour les gens qui ne me connaissent pas, mon nom est Judith Lefebvre, je suis chroniqueuse à Pivot, c'est peut-être comme ça que vous me connaissez, mais je suis aussi cofondatrice d'une organisation qui s'appelle le Mouvement transféministe, qui est une organisation féministe qui rassemble des femmes trans dans la défense de leurs droits. Et on a fait partie de la mosaïque, ou en tout cas, on a fait partie des initiatives entourant la mosaïque dès le départ. Et c'est dans ce contexte-là que je viens prendre la parole aujourd'hui. Donc, d'abord, une mosaïque, c'est un assemblage. Hein? C'est un assemblage de différentes formes, de différentes couleurs, de différents matériaux. On ne peut pas lire l'œuvre elle-même depuis ses parties. Il faut prendre un pas de recul. Il faut voir le dessin général, la fin qui est poursuivie. Mais la fin, elle se révèle au public, évidemment, dans l'observation, l'admiration patiente. Toutefois, l'artiste doit connaître dès le départ la fin qui est poursuivie, parce que c'est l'intention qui donne sa forme à l'œuvre. Dès la formation de l'initiative, les mouvements des groupes marginalisés ont fait partie des efforts d'Amir et de Catherine d'Alternative. Je salue en particulier le travail de Catherine Papas, parce qu'elle est souvent invisibilisée et elle en tient beaucoup sur les bras. Merci, Catherine. Et donc, à travers ces efforts-là, comme je le disais, il y a eu la formation de cette initiative-là et où les groupes marginalisés, les groupes migrants, féministes, trans, etc., ont été inclus dès le départ. Parce que quoi qu'on en dise, un rassemblement antifasciste, ce n'est pas une évidence, ce n'est pas facile, ce n'est pas une mince affaire, parce que tout le monde est contre les fachos, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire réellement faire barrage? Qu'est-ce que ça implique? De défense du statu quo, de commission avec l'État du monde tel qu'il est? Est-ce que ça veut dire défendre la démocratie bourgeoise? Est-ce que ça veut dire défendre l'économie libérale? Parce qu'on a entendu parler beaucoup de la montée du fascisme dans les dernières années comme un changement de vibe, une montée des discours haineux, de la méchanceté, de l'incivilité. Mais travailler avec les groupes marginalisés, c'est accepter que nous ne défendrons pas le monde qui se meurt. Les institutions violentes qui nous maintiennent subordonnés, sexualisés, dominés, que ce soit les femmes trans, les personnes migrantes, les personnes racisées, les travailleurs, travailleuses précaires, les personnes sans abri. Ce que la droite nous a tués, c'est un ordre dont nous ne voulons plus. Il n'y aura pas, pour nous, de retour en arrière. On est dans une... Merci. On est dans une époque de crise, et une crise, ça se dépasse, dialectiquement, diront certaines personnes. Et c'est par la solidarité, une solidarité réelle qui n'est pas fondée sur la peur abstraite d'un monstre qui se cacherait dans la psyché collective, hein, ce défaut de moralité que serait le fascisme. C'est pas là que se situe notre ennemi commun. Il n'est pas dans la conscience individuelle. Notre ennemi commun, il est au pouvoir. Notre ennemi commun, il exerce en ce moment le pouvoir, il adopte des lois, il perpètre un génocide et continue d'opprimer des gens ici et ailleurs, partout dans le monde, dans une guerre d'escalade impérialiste. La solidarité, donc, doit être réelle. Elle doit être fondée sur une évaluation, non pas des méchancetés ou des incivilités qui sont exprimées dans l'espace public, mais réellement sur une évaluation des rapports de force, sur une évaluation des puissances agissantes, sur le pouvoir. Il faut laisser de côté nos points-virgules dont on parlait plus tôt, travailler sur ce qui avance, sur ce qui fonctionne, en refusant toujours de reculer. Et donc, être contre la montée de la haine, ça ne suffit pas. Il faut faire barrage, et c'est par ce rassemblement des forces diversifiées, des forces complémentaires de la société civile que l'on va être capable de faire barrage réellement. Merci.
Alors, pour continuer avec notre soirée, on a un panel composé des personnes qui sont merveilleuses, qui sont là effectivement pour nous parler de ce qui se passe ailleurs et ce qui se passe ici. Fait que je vais céder la parole, mais je vais faire en premier une petite présentation à la merveilleuse Aurélie Lanctôt. Alors, elle est contributrice régulière à Le Devoir. Aurélie Lanctôt est professeure au département des sciences juridiques de l'UQAM. Elle s'implique également sur le comité enjeux carcéraux et droits des personnes en détention de la Ligue des droits et libertés. Ses recherches portent sur les théories féministes et l'épistémologie du droit, les regroupements entre le droit et la littérature, le droit pénal et les mécanismes de justice alternative. Alors, sans plus tarder, Aurélie.
On peut décoller, là. Nous, on peut décoller, là. Merci. Lui, il fonctionne, il y en a un ici.
Il y en a un. Ah, OK, parfait. Alors, bonsoir. Merci beaucoup pour cette généreuse présentation, Judith et Zaya. Merci également pour votre patience malgré le petit contretemps et imprévu. Comme vous savez, Naomi Klein devait être avec nous ce soir pour participer à notre panel qui sera d'une grande richesse par ailleurs, j'en suis convaincue. Bon, comme vous savez sans doute, Naomi Klein est journaliste et autrice primée. Elle va publier en septembre 2026 avec l'autrice Astra Taylor un ouvrage intitulé End Time Fascism, qui donc réfléchit en résonance avec le thème du panel de ce soir. Malgré le contretemps auquel elle a fait face, elle voulait nous faire parvenir un bref message de solidarité en vidéo qu'on me dit pourrait être lancé dès maintenant. Donc,
Okay, so this is incredibly embarrassing. This is Naomi Klein. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm so sad not to be able to join you live. I was just in a car accident. That's my car behind us getting towed away. I was just rear-ended, and I clearly have some kind of whiplash because I was rear-ended really hard. So I have to go to the hospital and be examined and deal with all of this. But I'm so glad that you're all gathering. I'm so glad that you're strategizing. This is a moment where we need to get out of our boxes and be as strong as we possibly can. The forces the fascism that is so obvious south of the border is very, very present in Canada. We've been calling it End Times Fascism, my co-author Astra Taylor and I, because the right now really understands that this whole project of capitalism and imperialism has set the world on fire, but they don't want to put the fire out. They just want to build bunkers for themselves. You know, the billionaires want to blast themselves into outer space and build their luxury private islands. But the kind of proletarian right wants to fortress the nation, wants to ethnically cleanse the nation and fortress it. That's the project. It's the project in Europe, it's the project in the United States, it's the project in the parts of Latin America that are turning fascist, and it's the project in Canada, in the parts of Canada that are turning fascist. So we are going to need to be as strategic as possible, to be as smart as possible, to be as aligned as possible, to set our priorities, and that's what this gathering I know is all about. So I'm with you in spirit, if not in body. I'm going to go to the hospital.
I'm taking you to the hospital now.
I really am so sorry and so embarrassed that this happened. I'm sure I look absolutely terrible, but there you have it. Okay. Merci beaucoup.
OK. Bon, ben, on la remercie quand même. Sans plus attendre, on aura l'occasion maintenant de passer à nos panélistes qui sont bel et bien présents ce soir et qu'on a beaucoup de chance d'avoir avec nous. Les personnes qu'on a rassemblées ici ce soir sont des personnes qui principalement ont une expérience sur le terrain de mobilisation en résistance à la montée de l'extrême droite et du fascisme dans différents contextes. Je vais d'abord vous les présenter, ensuite ils vont prendre la parole successivement, échanger entre eux et bien sûr, on ouvrira aux échanges avec la salle pour avoir l'occasion de rendre ça un peu plus interactif. Alors, tout d'abord, nous avons Bill Fletcher, qui est militant depuis l'adolescence. Après ses études, il est entré dans le mouvement syndical comme soudeur dans un chantier naval et il a progressé dans le monde syndical jusqu'à devenir cadre à l'American Federation of Labor and and Congress of Industrial Organizations. C'est l'ancien président du Trans-Africa Forum et chercheur principal à l'Institut for Policy Studies. Il est également co-auteur de plusieurs ouvrages sur le travail organisé et la justice sociale, et il est également chroniqueur et intervient fréquemment dans les médias sur les enjeux en lien avec l'organisation syndicale. Bienvenue, Bill. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous ce soir. Ah, oui. Ensuite, nous avons Aparna Sundar, qui est membre du Manat Collectif, qui est un collectif qui lutte contre le fascisme qui s'est formé à Toronto. Aparna milite aussi dans plusieurs organisations de solidarité avec l'Asie du Sud. Elle est membre du Forum canadien pour les droits de la personne et la démocratie en Inde, et elle travaille comme chercheuse pour une organisation syndicale. Bienvenue, Aparna. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous également. Ensuite, Kathleen Cole est militante et vit et travaille à Minneapolis, dans le Minnesota. Son action militante se focalise sur la lutte contre la violence d'État et la mise en place d'infrastructures et de mécanismes de prise en charge alternatifs pour répondre aux besoins des communautés. Récemment, elle a contribué à la mise en place et à la coordination de systèmes de défense communautaire à Minneapolis, même en particulier en réponse à l'opération Metro Surge, à travers laquelle le département de la sécurité intérieure traquait et harcelait les personnes en situation migratoire irrégulière. Elle est également professeure de sciences politiques et directrice du département de sciences sociales à la Metropolitan State University. Et elle a publié plusieurs articles sur la suprématie blanche, le jugement politique aux États-Unis, ainsi que sur la pédagogie antiraciste dans les cours de sciences politiques en particulier. Donc, bienvenue, Kathleen. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous. Et finalement, Julie Robillard, qui a travaillé dans différents secteurs du milieu communautaire à Montréal depuis la fin de ses études en sciences politiques. En particulier, actuellement, elle est au Mouvement d'éducation populaire et d'action communautaire du Québec, le MEPAC, depuis bientôt 4 ans. Le MEPAC, c'est un organisme, un regroupement national multisectoriel qui travaille à la transformation sociale dans une perspective de justice sociale. Le MEPAC rassemble 12 tables régionales en éducation populaire autonome qui regroupent environ 330 groupes populaires et communautaires autonomes. Merci beaucoup, Julie, également, d'être avec nous ce soir. Alors, pour commencer, je me tournerai d'abord vers Bill pour la première allocution. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous parler, dans votre expérience, de votre approche pour construire un mouvement large et inclusif, notamment dans le milieu syndical, pour s'opposer à l'autoritarisme?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Should I stand up or?
As you wish. Do you want to go to the?
Let me stand.
As you prefer. Yeah.
So good evening. My answer to the question, I think I was told I had like 10 minutes to answer this.
You have more.
A half hour? Okay. We're getting warmer. Critical thing, there's a very famous expression from Martin Luther King that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. It's a beautiful expression. It's wrong. But the problem is that many of us accepted it as basically true. And the idea behind it is that no matter how bad things would get, we could guarantee that at the end of the day, we will win. The reality is that we cannot, that there is no certainty of victory. But the problem for much of the progressive and left movements is that we've made the assumption that inevitably we will win, and that no matter how bad things get, we will still win. Now, one can believe that in their soul and can pray on that, but politically, we can never make that assumption. we should always make the assumption that defeat is not acceptable, but it is possible. Therefore, we have to act accordingly. And that means that we've got to think very carefully about the nature of our opponent, what they are doing, and how we can respond. Now, one of the challenges within much of the left has been the assumption that any form of repression in a capitalist society means that fascism is just around the corner. And the problem with that is that it actually glamorizes democratic capitalism. See, in the democratic capitalism, all kinds of repression can take place. Murders, extrajudicial violence, etc. And the existence of that, the existence of brutal prisons, does not mean fascism is over the horizon. Fascism is a particular form of capital rule when it achieves power. It is a social movement. And this is the one thing I really want to underline. It is fundamentally a social movement. It is not about a maniac who might be in office. It is not about a collection of billionaires that wish to be in a satellite orbiting the Earth. It is about a social movement that links with a segment of capital that has fundamentally decided that it cannot win hegemony using the instruments of democratic capitalism. Now, the fact of it being a social movement means that what the Occupy movement had been saying years ago was also wrong. When they said there was a 99% against the 1%, no, that is an illusion. It's not that there's a huge segment in our societies that, if not supports fascism, supports right-wing authoritarianism. And so that means that has to be factored into any strategy that we're doing, including within popular movements, such as the labor movement, right? That you can't make the assumption that the enemy is a small group sitting somewhere. We have to understand that the enemy may even be literally in our own families. And that there are people that have bought into the basic right-wing authoritarianism and fascism. They've bought into it, they've made assumptions, they have lost their empathy. In fact, there is a movement within the Christian nationalists in opposition to empathy. And it's specifically saying that empathy is contrary to Christianity. And so there's this process that's going on, and this movement that has emerged, is not just gradual, it's not just increased repression. They wish to completely overturn all aspects of democratic capitalism. It is, in that sense, quite radical. It is radical in terms of the kind of society that they wish to bring about, a society based to a great extent on racism, sexism, militarism, xenophobia, irrationalism, etc. That is the kind of society that they seek to bring in, and they wish to see a fundamental break with democratic capitalism. So there are things that are existing in democratic capitalist societies that make it possible, make it easier for fascists to emerge and operate. There's ways that fascist groups are tolerated. But what the fascists ultimately wish to do is carry out their own version of a revolution. And one of the things that we have to understand is that they're armed. This is not a debating society. They are armed. Now, I don't know in Canada. I do know in the United States, these people have weapons, and I'm not talking about pop guns. I'm not talking about shotguns. I'm talking about RPGs. I'm talking about machine guns, etc. And they have a vision of a particular kind of war that they wish to bring about. Now, what does that mean for us? It means, on the one hand, the good news is that in most of our societies, the bulk of the population is in opposition to a fascist solution. That's the good news. The problem is that bulk of the society is not well organized and is not necessarily unified. And part of the task, a central part of the task of the left, is to build a broad front in opposition to the far right. Now, this is going to be very challenging. It's going to be very challenging because many of us on the left are not really used to doing that. We may talk about it, but the idea of building a broad front, building unity with people that you don't necessarily like, people that you may not be able to trust, but people that you know that you need in order to defeat the opponent, this becomes the order of the day. And that's one of the fundamental things that we've got to be thinking about. What are some of the obstacles? Well, sectarianism is a big obstacle. One of the obstacles that I've seen in the United States that has been an immense obstacle is brand. That the rise of brand is a very interesting form of sectarianism, where you have these different organizations that are trying to position themselves. This is particularly true in the NGO world. Different organizations that are trying to position themselves as if they are the ones that have the solution. And they go to the funders to seek funding for what they're doing, and they don't go to the funders and say, why don't you give us money to work together? Why don't you give us money to help to build a united front? Instead, they go and basically say, no, give my organization resources. And I've participated in discussions with different organizations, and it's remarkable, where these organizations are in opposition to the far right. But when they talk about what their organization is doing. Not once have I heard these organizations say, you know what? After this meeting, those that want to do X, let's have a special meeting to figure out what we're going to do next. Instead, it's, we're going to have a demonstration. We're filing a lawsuit, etc. What the other side understands, and they've understood this for a very long time, is that they've got a plan, they've got to build unity. They're more authoritarian, so they can insist on unity in a different way than we can. But they operate in a way to move the discussion and to move in a coordinated fashion, even when there is a division of labor. In the late 1960s, and please tell me if I'm moving on too long. Okay. In the late 1960s in the United States, in the aftermath of the collapse of the defeat of the Barry Goldwater presidential campaign, one of the things that happened was that there were a group of very visionary far-right thinkers. Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich are two of the names that are worth looking up. And they decided that it was important to build a new kind of right wing. And that new kind of right wing was going to include building mass movements, engaging in litigation, engaging in identification, training of elected officials who would begin primarily running at the local level. They collaborated with the consolidation of the media. And over the 1970s and early 1980s, they started building very important alliances with the Christian nationalists. That was the development of the new right. It was a right-wing populist collection that helped to bring Ronald Reagan in the United States into office. But it went beyond that. And one of the things that held it to some extent in check was the Cold War. Because the existence of the Cold War forced many of the ruling circles in the capitalist world, even if they hated each other, to figure out ways of working together. But when the Cold War ended, a lot of the basis that brought those sections of the ruling groups together started to evaporate. In the United States, we started to see that in the 1992 presidential campaign. And it was there that we started to see a move away from traditional Republican and Democratic Party rhetoric. And coming out of the Republican Party particularly was the rhetoric of war. War against the Democrats, war against the left, war against others. And this is something that took on sort of a life of its own in 1994 when Newt Gingrich led into taking control of Congress in the United States. Again, there was no interest in any kind of bipartisanship. These folks were into a war essentially of annihilation. On the side of the Democratic Party, the Democrats, which accepted neoliberalism pretty much wholesale by the 1980s, continued to believe in the idea of bipartisanship and that they could convince the Republicans to move back back away from the more radical elements of the far right. Instead, the more radical elements moved farther to the right, became invigorated. And each time a concession was made by the Democrats, the Republicans became stronger. While this is going on, many people on the left were denying the rise of a far right. I remember in 2014, I was in a meeting at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung office in New York, and it was planning a conference. And we got into this discussion about the rise of right-wing populism, and I found myself to be the only person in the room of about maybe a dozen people that said, there is a profound danger coming from right-wing populists. And people poo-pooed that. They claimed that I was downplaying the danger from centrist Democrats, that there really was no major danger coming from the far right. And this view continued on through, believe it or not, the January 6, 2021 coup attempt in the United States. In the aftermath, and I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to embarrass certain people, although they're not in this room, so I guess I could embarrass them. I was told by someone in the aftermath of that coup attempt, when I said, we've got to understand what that was about and that these people are not playing any games. And the person said, yeah, but what it showed was the resilience of bourgeois democracy. And I don't remember my exact words. I can't really repeat them here, but they kind of would be like, what planet are you on? But I'm from New York, so I'd say it in a different way. It was unbelievable. But now what's happened is that as the danger of a fascist threat, a move away from a right-wing populist, loose assortment of groups into the MAGA movement, which has taken on the characteristics of a fascist movement. Now you have people that it's hard for people to downplay that. They're acknowledging it, but they don't really know what to do about it. And they're stuck. You have some people in the trade union movement that to this day do not want to talk about the danger of a fascist threat. They keep talking about the billionaires this, the billionaires that, as if the only danger is from there. And not acknowledging that even within the ranks of our own unions, we have MAGA elements. All right, so what can we do? There's a few things. The first thing is to conceptualize the notion of a broad front. And the broad front has, I want you to think about it metaphorically like the skin of an onion. On the outer skin is what I'd call the anti-fascist consensus. That is a broad grouping of people who stand in opposition to fascism. Their politics are all over the map, but they are in opposition to the fascists. The next skin layer is what I'd call the left progressive bloc. That is, folks that believe that it's not enough to just oppose the fascists, but we need to be offering a different vision for what should come after the defeat of the fascists and the defeat of neoliberalism. And the next skin after that should be, in my opinion, the socialists. And the socialists need to be operating on all three levels. and not just one level. They can't just be standing, waving a flag, expecting the people are going to salute that. We need to be good at building alliances. We need to be the ones that are absolutely thinking at all times, how do we strengthen the anti-fascist consensus? How do we bring in more forces? How do we peel people off? So I'll give you an example from the trade union movement, and it's something that I've said to other trade union people, that when you're going in to organize an unorganized workplace, one of the things that organizers do is that they have a scale. And the scale might be from 1 to 4, or maybe 1 to 5. Some of you are probably very familiar with that. A 1 is someone who is solidly with the union and wants to do work. A 2 is someone who is solidly with the union and is on again, off again in terms of doing work, but you can count on them. A 3 is the middle one, and a 4 is someone in opposition to the union. Any good organizer will say, you spend no time with the 4s. None. Because when you spend time with the 4s, even if you like them, you energize them. You encourage them. They become motivated to move against you. What you want to do is neutralize them. The objective should be to unite the 1s and the 2s, to win over 3s and isolate the 4s. That's what we have to do in society as a whole. I've had to do this even within my own family. No, seriously. I have a relative who is a Trumpster. We cannot talk politics. It is useless to talk politics, even though I'm very mischievous, and so every so often I fire a missile across the DMZ, and then he fires one back at me, right? But in general, we can't talk politics. There's no point, right? We can talk about other things. That's the way we've got to be thinking in society as a whole, that there are people that will not be won over. Now, for many people, that's going to sound very cold. No, we can't be thinking that way, Bill. We've got to win over the 99%, and that's not going to work. It has never worked. We've got to build up a core, and we've got to expand that core so that that core thinks of itself as the majority, which leads to my last point. That part of our work in opposing the fascists is to build or rebuild a new conception of the people. That one of the things that neoliberalism has been extremely successful at is atomizing us. We think about being ourselves in our own little worlds, watching the things that we want to watch, not wanting to go outside, not wanting to answer the door, not wanting to answer the phone, and just leave me the hell alone. That should be the slogan, right, that neoliberalism has advanced. Leave me alone and I will do fine. Or even if I'm not doing fine, I'm going to do it alone. Part of what we have to be doing is constructing a new identity of the people, of the majority, of the anti-fascist majority, that we are the majority. We are people that are suffering many things in common, though not everything. We are coming together to build or to beat back barbarism. We are coming together to build a new society. And we on the left and left progressive forces, as part of that, need in every case to have a platform. This is one of the debates we're having in the United States. And that'll be my final point, that we're trying to engage people in the idea that there needs to be a platform, something that we stand for, that we can point to and say, this is what we're fighting for. We're not just against Trump. We're not just against Musk. We're not just against Thiel. We're not just against Bannon. But we actually have a view of a different society. That's what we're fighting for. That's what we should unite around. And in that sense, I remain actually quite optimistic. Even though I know that we can be defeated, I'm convinced that defeat isn't an option. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment. Merci beaucoup, Bill, pour ces remarques vraiment très belles sur la pratique du dissensus et l'oignon de l'antifascisme. Moi, j'aime bien, je la retiens, celle-là. Je pense que ça met admirablement bien la table. Si je me tourne maintenant vers Aparna, comme je le mentionnais en introduction, vous êtes impliqué significativement dans la construction de solidarité et de pratiques antifascistes dans la diaspora indienne à Toronto, mais également dans des réseaux de solidarité envisagés davantage à l'échelle globale. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous parler davantage de ces efforts de mobilisation-là, tant dans le contexte canadien qu'à travers des solidarités transnationales?
Thank you, Aurélie. Oops, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you, Aurélie. And, you know, it's said all the time, but it's really hard to come after Bill Fletcher. So bear with me. And, you know, this was an opportunity that I couldn't resist to actually be on the same panel as him. And so, you know, I have to put up with whatever that means in terms of coming after. I just want to start by, before answering the question, just saying congratulations to all of the groups and organizations that have come together to launch this Mosaïque des résistances. There's really nothing more timely than this move to come together in alliance and recognizing the need to work together despite all our different focuses and orientations. And I also want to thank Catherine and Feroz of Alternatives for inviting me to speak at this really momentous gathering. I'll talk a little bit about, before going into the organizing in the diaspora in Canada and transnationally, I would like to set up the stage a little bit about what we're organizing against. And primarily what we are organizing against is a form of fascism that is Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. Hindu nationalism is essentially the idea that India is or should become a Hindu nation. And it's the process of bringing that Hindu nation into being. This is not a new idea. And like Bill said, there has been a strong social movement with an organization that came up 100 years ago in 1925, inspired by all of the globally circulating fascist ideologies of that period, and borrowing those ideas, but also contributing to them ideas of ethno-racial supremacy, Hindu supremacy, and the attempt to construct a kind of mythical great past, great Hindu past for India. What this also meant, of course, and continues to mean today, is that the 1,000 years or so, when there were some fantastic rulers in India who were Muslim, that history is being written out to the point where there's textbooks leaving out that take out the Mughal dynasty that ruled India from 1526 until the British established their rule finally in 1857. And so when you ask the question, who built the Taj Mahal, you know, you might have to answer that it was Modi who did it, because this whole history is being written out. Anyway, just to continue, the construction of this Hindu majority under a patriarchal, Brahminical, or privileged caste scriptural description of Hinduism requires resisting challenges from Dalits or caste-oppressed groups to the deeply hierarchical caste order of Hinduism and co-opting them and Adivasis or indigenous communities into the Hindu fold in order to construct a Hindu majority. And at the same time, it requires the definition of others, such as Muslims and Christians, as outsiders or alien to the nation. Since Modi was first, and actually, I thought I had less time, but because I have a little bit more time and because Bill opened up that, I just wanted to give you the context in which Narendra Modi and the BJP came to power nationally in 2014. Part of the context was that the Congress party that was in power before them had put in place certain policies, and even before that in the late 80s, the BJP came into politics as the political wing of this RSS, which was the 100-year-old organization with the ideology of Hindutva. The BJP came into politics in the middle of the 80s and became really visible and active in the late 80s because they wanted to fight back or to take on new policies that were expanding affirmative action for caste-oppressed groups. So this was really a movement in its present political incarnation that is about, in a way, resisting the expansion of rights to caste-oppressed groups, and then, in a way, using other kinds of politics, like the hatred of Muslims, as a kind of distraction or scapegoating. But Modi came to power in 2014 specifically because the Congress party before it had introduced various kinds of social welfare legislation, not because it was the party that neoliberalized India, that introduced neoliberal reforms, but when they became more extreme, there was pushback. Some of the left parties that were supporting the Congress required them to pass social welfare legislation, and it led to a real fear among some of the capitalists in India that it was going in the wrong direction, that the Congress, which they thought was reliably one of their parties, was actually now being pulled away into kind of a more populist roots. And so they looked around for who to throw their weight behind, and they found Narendra Modi, who was at that time the chief minister of the western state of Gujarat, and had already carried out some really frightening kinds of actions there. Essentially, he presided over the pogrom against of Muslims, which resulted in the death of 3,000 Muslims in 2002. But his governance of that state, he used that then to come back to power in that state with an even greater majority, and his state became really the laboratory for Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, because he was able to show that you could use hatred and division and violence to win political power. So since he's come to power in 2014, efforts at erasing Muslim life have reached frightening proportions, with social vigilantism in the form of attacks, lynchings, destruction of homes, and places of worship being legitimized by the state through legislation that provides justification and impunity for these crimes. A legislative process of disenfranchisement for Muslims that began in 2019 is now being completed in some states by the revision of electoral rolls that has led to the removal of millions in 2 states, just in 2 states, millions of voters, a large majority of them women and Muslims. This total mobilization of state and society to wage war on Hindutva's other targets including religious minorities like Christians and Sikhs, left and liberal intellectuals and activists, journalists, university faculty and students, artists, feminists, and members of civil society organizations. All of these are portrayed as enemies of the authentic nation and are subject to attacks, silencing, and even arrests. This all works because of a captive mainstream media, as well as social media cells that work overtime, producing fake news and rumors to generate a climate of paranoia, scapegoating, hate, moral panics, and conspiracies. Accompanying this, this project is being furthered by the complete state capture by the BJP and by the executive under Narendra Modi of previously and constitutionally independent bodies, such as various regulatory institutions, and now even the judiciary, the Election Commission of India and the judiciary, but also of universities, science bodies, a whole list of governmental and paragovernmental and non-governmental organizations are now being taken over or infiltrated by the BJP, placing its own people in power there. And the state apparatus is also used to control and manipulate and suppress dissent, to control the mainstream media, and of course to carry out surveillance. There's also the use of the armed forces, specifically in some areas that are described as being separatist or as having terrorist movements or insurgent movements, and these in particular is the northern state of Kashmir, which is long, has claimed autonomy and independence, but has been militarily occupied for a long time. That occupation has been intensified under the BJP, but also other areas such as in the central Indian region, state of Chhattisgarh, where the military was called out to fight against armed left-wing guerrilla organizations fighting to defend forest dwellers and peasants from having their lands taken from them. The police are also used very, very frequently to arrest critics and dissenters. You'll find them often standing by as the social vigilantes, the Hindu vigilantes, are beating up Muslims or bulldozing Muslim homes, and the police are watching. And then often, if these families go to register cases saying our home was bulldozed, they become the subject of arrest, and the police file cases against them. And we see this constant kind of complete perversion of justice taking place. There's also, and it's important to mention, that all of this is in part a cover for or tied to the deepening of a highly predatory form of capitalism, and in particular under two big monopoly capitalist groups that are very close to Modi. They come from the same western state of Gujarat as him, Ambani and Adani. They're huge conglomerates. And under the Modi government, under the BJP, they have been given extensive license, opening up of forest lands, coastal lands, free lands. They've been sold various kinds of public utilities. They are now in almost every sector, including telecom, and are really so many public resources are now being privatized and handed over to these conglomerates, but of course, others as well in high tech and in finance and in real estate. And finally, the last piece of this is, of course, enabled by Modi's own, what one might call, monarchical populism. He is a supreme leader who brooks no dissent. He reaches out directly to his subjects rather than through the media, and who dispenses personalized welfare strategically in the lead up to elections. So there'll be gas cylinders handed out with his photo on them, big bags of grain handed out with his photo on them, and especially in the run up to elections. And lastly, one shouldn't forget this aspect of this regime, which is that on the international stage, it is becoming closer and closer in its alliance both with Israel and the United States. Even though under Trump, there's been some shaking of that relationship, the relationship with Israel is grown stronger. There was a time when India, like other global South countries and decolonizing countries, actually cut ties to Israel. And when I got my first passport in the 1980s, it actually said, cannot be used for travel to South Africa and Israel. But that is ancient history now and has long changed, and India and Israel are very close partners in defense, surveillance technologies. India refuses to censure Israel or support any resolutions against it in multilateral forums, and it suppresses any kind of pro-Palestinian solidarity organizing within India. So it's a bit of a long description, and apologies for that, but unless I lay that out, it's hard to get a sense of what we in the diaspora are organizing against. The diaspora is really critical to the Hindutva project because, in a sense, what they're trying to do is harness the caste-privileged Hindu diaspora spread across the Caribbean, North America, Europe, and Australia, to harness them to a sense of a greater nation, a kind of civilizational project. And for the diaspora itself, India under the BJP is seen to mark a moment of arrival on the world stage and a moment of arrival for themselves in their countries of settlement, emboldening them in their cultural practices and assertions of identity. Before the rise of the BJP to political power, some of the most active members of the diaspora in relation to India were those who'd organized against previous forms of authoritarianism in India, like the emergency declared by the Congress Party in 1975. And in fact, a group of them had mobilized very successfully after 2002 and the pogrom against Muslims in Gujarat, to have the US government deny Narendra Modi a visa to visit the US. This, of course, that denial, the ban on his travel to the US was revoked when he became prime minister in 2014. And India, you know, it was important to become friends with one of the largest markets in the world. And at the same time, when he came to power, of course, the caste privileged sections of the diaspora, who make up a large part of the model minority of the US, in the US in particular, in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and other professional classes like that, became even more ardently pro-Modi and assertively Hindu with all its attendant casteism. So this Hindu diaspora uses the spaces created by multiculturalism to actually assert its caste privilege, to equate India with Hindus, and that strengthening diaspora has meant that those of us who are opposing Hindu nationalism have our tasks cut out, in the sense that we also have to do work in solidarity and support of what's happening in India, but increasingly Hindutva in the diaspora and in North America is itself becoming an extremely powerful force that we need to organize against. So the organization, so that this has led, of course, to diasporic activists feeling the need to be more united, more organized, more strategic, and to build alliances with other progressive forces in the US and Canada. And there's been all kinds of work now that diaspora activists have been called on to do. Those who are academics are now sort of charged with defending authentic histories of India against the kinds of new history writing that is taking place within the country. Others are, of course, groups that represent Indian minorities, Muslims, caste-oppressed groups like Dalits, Sikhs, and Christians, and they are organizing essentially to bring to the attention of the states of Canada, and I'm going to speak now about Canada and the United States in particular, bring to attention to them the kinds of marginalization and hate that and legislative marginalization that they are facing in India, and to sort of try and bring sanctions against that. And thirdly, they're looking at the flows of funds from Hindutva groups in North America to support activities in India. So against this background, the North American alliance that I'm part of is called India Civil Watch International, and this has developed a kind of two-pronged approach to deal with this. On the one hand, we employ what we call a framework of strategic opportunism, which comes out of engaging constantly with the social movement forces there, but recognizing that we cannot intervene in all of the different things, all of the different struggles that they're engaged in. So trying to think about which ones would be most effectively highlighted by those of us operating in the international sphere. And some of those include those related to crony capitalism in mining and development, and of course the role of large social media companies like Facebook and WhatsApp in spreading this hate, and in also during the elections, kind of putting out fake news that favors the BJP. The other framework that we work with in the diaspora is that of what we call dual visibilization, which is the attempt to do two things. One is to make visible the majority of Indians in the diaspora, make it visible that they are not actually Hindutva supporters, that there is actually a large majority who are either minority Christians and Muslims and Sikhs, or who are just people who do not agree with this project of Hindu nationalism, who are socialists, left groups, and others. And so that's that attempt to build that kind of unity within ourselves and to make our majority within the Indian diaspora more visible. But the second kind of visibilization is to try to make the argument of why Hindu nationalism matters not only to Indians in the diaspora, but to everyone else in North America. And the kinds of, and in a way, the rise of Trump 2.0, the rise of MAGA forces, the rise of fascism in the US has actually helped in some ways to make our point more clearly. First of all, because people actually now recognize, to some extent, what fascism means. And India was one of the early sort of fascist nation. So in 2014, it was harder to explain than it is now in 2026. But it's also recognizing that these same Hindutva forces are making alliances with many far-right forces, and they were actually supportive of MAGA until recently, when many MAGA forces actually decided that the Hindus were non-Christians, that they belonged to various whatever the word is, sects that were, idol worshippers and so on. And so there's now some tension, but until then they were actually working quite closely together. And similarly, they're making alliances with the Zionists using very much the same arguments that I'll come to in a minute. And so our job, what we're trying to do is also make these alliances that go beyond the Indian diaspora to other groups who are similarly now working against the rise of the far right, the rise of authoritarianism and fascism. So within Canada in particular, and I know I'm going on a bit, but I've just got a few more minutes. In Canada, I just want to move to Canada specifically because I am from Toronto and that's the landscape within which we work. We have identified a few specific kinds of Hindu nationalist organizations, and there was a very good survey done by, or a study done by the National Council of Canadian Muslims and the World Sikh Organization that actually identified the kinds of organizations that exist here. Some are service organizations, religious organizations, including temples. So the service organizations collect funds for supposedly relief projects in India, but most of them go either to relief through RSS-related fronts in India. Religious organizations likewise raise money, take donations, and transfer it to these funds in India, but also do various kinds of cultural work to promote Hinduism, and specifically this very casteist and patriarchal form of Hinduism in North America. Many other groups that are affiliated to the RSS in India are with names such as the Coalition of Hindus of North America or the Canadian Organization for Hindu Heritage Education, run classes for kids, summer camps, to sort of introduce children to their culture. And they solicit funding, of course, again, for projects in India. Then there are those organizations that do advocacy to strengthen the ties of India and Canada, business relationships, state-to-state relationships, and so on. And this includes the Overseas Friends of the BJP, which actively and openly campaigns for the BJP in Canada, even though that's against, that is not legally allowed. And finally, to just mention one more Hindutva actor in Canada, it is the Indian state itself. So many of you will, of course, be familiar with the extraterritorial assassination of Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in BC 3 years ago. And so that's well known, but there are various much sort of less well-known ways in which the state operates, going to various kinds of cultural functions, projecting India as largely Hindu, but also surveilling those such as Sikhs and others who are seen as dissenters, anti-Hindutva. So the state is very much present as an actor within Canadian society. And the kinds of strategies they use, there's two really important ones to mention. One is that they resist any kind of work that is going on that is against caste discrimination. So with the growth of the Hindu diaspora and a more assertive casteist form of diaspora in North America, we have seen more expressions of caste discrimination against caste oppressed groups. In Silicon Valley, in universities, in homes, people are using caste to discriminate, to not give people houses on rent, to not employ people who they identify as being caste oppressed. And so there's a movement then to get caste recognized in various jurisdictions as a protected category under human rights legislation of different kinds, so to add it to gender identity or race and so on. And this has been quite successful. The Toronto District School Board agreed to include caste as a protected category. Some city councils in Seattle in the US, Burnaby in BC, have also passed resolutions adding caste as a protected category. This is intolerable to the Hindu forces, who use another strategy to counter it. They argue that, in fact, there is a growing Hindu-phobia within Canada and the United States. So Hindu-phobia, they argue, has grown so much that, they put forward a resolution, or they put forward a petition to Parliament with 20,000 signatures, 25,000 signatures, calling for a bill to be passed against Hindu-phobia. This was luckily, of course, dismissed quite quickly. But city councils, both in Alberta and in Mississauga in Ontario, have actually passed resolutions condemning Hindu-phobia. However, when you look at who they describe as Hindu-phobes, it turns out to be organizations representing Indian minorities and caste-oppressed groups and other critics of the Indian state and its project of Hindu nationalism. So what Hindu-phobia is doing is it's taking directly from the IRA playbook and the weaponization of anti-Semitism to shut down the Israeli activities of the Israeli state. It's trying to do very much the same thing with relation to the Indian state. So that through this kind of narrative reframing of Hindu supremacy as Hinduism, the Hindu right is able to position any challenges to it as anti-Hindu or Hindu-phobic, and to use this kind of language of multiculturalism and the kind of spaces provided by multiculturalism to actually push the Hindu supremacist agenda. And Canadian institutions like universities and various arts institutions and so on, we find are unable to actually take this on or understand it for what it is, because so they actually just cave in. And so, if the Hindus will protest, the Hindu nationalists protest against an exhibition because they argue that it's somehow Hindu-phobic because it's critical of the Indian state, the art gallery, hosting it might back down and apologize because they actually think it's about hurting Hindu sentiments. The other thing they do is, of course, are now lots of cultural festivals where an aggressive performance of Hindu culture, representing a kind of symbolic economy that is well appreciated by the insiders and the specific outsiders being targeted, is presented as a kind of benign expression of culture. And then, of course, defense of the Indian state, so any kind of criticism, they'll be out there, defending it in various ways. And the final strategy they have, of course, is to build alliances. And one of the strongest alliances they've built is with the Zionists, where they've had meetings together, where they're learning strategy and organizing methods from each other, because they see the value of using the same kind of playbook, but they also know the much deeper relationship that the two states have. So none of this has, of course, gone unchallenged, and we have been organizing in Canada as well for a long time against this. There's a kind of long history of South Asian diasporic organizing in BC, as well as here in Montreal, where a generation of activists from the 70s and 80s created a range of various kinds of organizations, political, social, cultural, such as the Montreal Sarai Magazine, the South Asian Women's Center and the Immigrants Women's Center, the South Asia Resources and Research Center. But now we have, since the rise of Hindutva, a newer, younger South Asian organization in Montreal, which is called the South Asia Diasporic Action Collective, or SADA. And this is possibly the most militant and active in Canada in the fight against Hindutva, organizing various kinds of counter-protests, protest statements, and so on. 4 years ago, SADAC, the CERAS, or the Center for Resources and Research on South Asia in Montreal, the South Asia Dalit Adivasi Network, and the Canadian Council of Indian Muslims in Toronto, and various other individuals and organizations came together to form the Canadian Forum for Human Rights and Democracy in India, in an attempt to actually strengthen our organizing across the Canadian space and to coordinate anti-Hindutva activism And we've had some successes taking on the Hindu-phobia bill, the attempt to get a Hindu-phobia bill, getting that dismissed, challenging the attempts to not name caste as a protected category, and also calling out these cultural assertions like the Chariot Festival in Toronto. But again, here our work is now changing. And while there were some openings under Trudeau, because he took this strong stand against the assassination of Niger, and that threw some light on the way in which the Indian state was surveilling Sikhs and other activists in Canada, these openings are shrinking under Carney. The largest trade delegation from India anywhere came to Canada just last week. Canada's trade minister will now be going to India with an equally large delegation, and Canada's looking to double exports to markets beyond the United States, including, of course, India. So in this context, Carney's priorities are clear. Despite the regular lip service to Canadian values of democracy, human rights, and rule of law, he will not be challenging the increasing disappearance of these in India under Modi. So finally, just to say, recognizing these kinds of shifts that are now taking place within Canada itself, we are also part of a kind of a collective that has emerged, or a network that has emerged in Toronto, and me and my colleague Stefana here from that collective, or that it's really not even a collective, it's a network that we call the Mannat Network. And this has come up, in a sense, recognizing that the Carney government itself represents a growing form of authoritarianism in Canada with its legislation on border control, economic development, and militarization, and simultaneously the growing presence in our cities of far-right white supremacist groups with their hate-filled agendas against trans people, against immigrants, and so on. And so this Mannat collective is now, we're trying to come together to understand and map the kinds of far-right forces within Canada, to understand the role of different forms of fossil fuel and other capital that is supporting some of these far-right groups, but also the implications of the increasingly, of new legislation under Carney, and how that might be impacting or creating a kind of turn towards authoritarianism in Canada. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to essentially speak about this collective as well, just because in a way it is coming together of our South Asian diasporic organizing with other forms of progressive organizing within the city.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup pour cette cartographie à la fois des résistances et des dangers de la montée du mouvement Inuit au Canada. Me tournant maintenant vers Kathleen et retournant vers le contexte états-unien qui nous a occupé tout à l'heure avec Bill. Kathleen, est-ce que tu pourrais nous parler un peu plus des mobilisations auxquelles tu as participé à Minneapolis, à la fois des stratégies, des gains, des défis auxquels vous avez fait face, tant autour de l'opération Metro Surge que plus largement?
So I also want to thank everybody for having me and getting to be here, and I'm so grateful to get to be a part of this conversation. And I also feel like so much of what I was planning to say, Bill said. So there will be a lot of resonances between what we have to say is happening in the United States. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm an organizer and I'm a political scientist, and I'm currently living in Minneapolis. I moved there 13 years ago and immediately started organizing in Minneapolis as soon as I got there. And so I've been there now for multiple movement cycles, including the most recent actions under federal occupation with Operation Metro Surge. And what I've seen in Minneapolis over the last 13 years, it gives me some hope, but it also makes it very clear to me the ways in which we are not prepared to win in the fight against fascism. And I think right now what's happening, when I talk to organizers in other parts of the country or in other countries, Minneapolis is being really idealized right now. And there's kind of this idea that we all get along and everything's perfect and like everybody should learn from Minneapolis. And I think there's actually a more realistic view of what's happening in Minneapolis that I plan to share with you this evening. So in Minneapolis, in the summer of 2025, veteran organizers started to prepare our rapid response networks, knowing that ICE was coming. So we started building our rapid response networks in like June and July with the anticipation of ICE starting to really aggressively ramp up deportations in our city. By December, folks had autonomously organized themselves into community defense networks all over the city. And these community defense networks coordinated many different types of actions. So we were coordinating rapid response. And just in case you're not familiar, so rapid response is channels that would mobilize hundreds or up to 1,000 people per channel to show up to a raid to interrupt the raid. We also had patrols systems set up that would have folks either on bikes or walking or in their cars, tracking ICE's movements through our neighborhoods, following them so that they could not stop to abduct our neighbors, so putting 3, 4, 5 cars on them so they wouldn't be able to stop, and interrupting abductions as they were happening. We also had mutual aid programs, block captains programs, which were a way to keep impacted folks non-identifiable, but to still receive mutual aid through relationship networks, rent relief, and a lot of other formations that were meant to meet the needs of impacted communities. And we were able to set up these systems relatively quickly because we have a large community of organizers who are very practiced in moving in decentralized horizontal systems. And so because we've done this in a number of movement cycles now in Minneapolis, it's very easy for us to set up that kind of infrastructure. And also, Minneapolis is a small city. And so if you're organizing in Minneapolis, you're going to know other organizers. And so it's really easy to, through those relationship networks, coordinate community defense systems across the city at the scale we're working at. So during the uprising in 2020, neighbors from across Minneapolis had organized themselves into neighborhood defense networks. And these defense formations were really focused on defending us from white supremacists who were coming from outside of Minneapolis to try to inflame things during the uprising, whether they were coming from other states or parts of Minnesota outside of Minneapolis. But also we were developing mutual aid networks in Minneapolis at that time, largely in response to our government's wholly insufficient response to COVID. And this experience in 2020 of hyperlocal, thank you. Is this good? So this experience in 2020 of hyperlocal organizing and community defense and community care really laid the foundation for us to develop the infrastructure that we needed during Operation Metro Surge. And what we built to respond to ICE was really beautiful in Minneapolis. Neighborhoods banded together into what we were calling community defense areas. And we took responsibility for our communities, providing mutual aid, defending against abductions in our geographies. We also built relay systems so that we could facilitate communication across those neighborhoods. And we had really incredible folks who developed citywide infrastructure. So we had folks who were monitoring the Whipple building, which is the federal, where the occupation was headquartered in Minnesota, where the federal agents were and where they would often take abducted folks to. We had them monitoring how many cars, what cars were coming in and out. We were able to then, these folks developed a license plate database, which is what actually allowed us to like chase ICE out of our neighborhoods because we could track them through their vehicles. There were also folks who autonomously developed patrols and dispatch protocols and trained neighbors, whether they lived in North Minneapolis, Northeast, South, on common systems for patrols and dispatch, so that we were able to track and disrupt ICE in our neighborhoods. And from December to March in Minneapolis, all of this demonstrated how successful horizontal, decentralized, autonomous collective action can be. It was a time of horrific violence and harm, and at the same time, that period also showed how powerful we can be when we come together to say a collective no. At the height of the occupation in Minneapolis, there were around 3,000 ICE agents, or at least that was the official number of ICE agents, but there were tens of thousands of us working in these neighborhood networks to collectively interrupt and prevent abductions. And as a community, we were committed to making it impossible for them to do their work effectively. We knew that they would give up before we would. And we were working collectively because we had solidarity with immigrant communities and with each other. And we were bound by our solidarity our solidarity was bound around our common identification of an enemy. In Minneapolis, excuse my language, fuck ICE became how we said hello to each other, how we said goodbye to each other. We also, we would chant it in public places and begin and end all of our meetings with it. And we were really powerfully connected through our collective refusal of this manifestation of the fascist regime. But since ICE has withdrawn, that solidarity has really taken a hit. And, you know, for organizers who've been a part of movement cycles, you know that this is a normal part of the movement cycle. But it's especially pronounced, perhaps, in this moment because of the intense emotional demands patrollers faced when doing their work. These folks were putting themselves in physical danger every day as they put themselves in direct contact with ICE agents. And with nothing more than cameras on their phones and whistles, they were putting their bodies on the line to defend our immigrant neighbors. And when they were patrolling in their cars, identifying ICE vehicles, following ICE, preventing them from stopping, this all required them to be hyper-vigilant. They had to be constantly looking for threats. And that led to the development of really strong social bonds between patrollers. But they were socially bonded around this common enemy and hypervigilance. And so once ICE retreated from the city, we had people who had really fried nervous systems, who were very practiced now in looking for an enemy and having bonds over who's the bad guy. And that very quickly started to tear apart the community defense networks that we've built in Minneapolis. All over the city, people have conflict. There are factions, there are hurt feelings, accusations, misunderstandings, and the huge, beautiful network that we built for collective action is receding. People have gone back to their regular lives, partly because they believe that the situation has been handled, which it hasn't, it's only shifted in its tactics, but partly because they've burned out or flamed out. And I think what the example of Minneapolis shows us is that we really, at least in Minneapolis, maybe y'all have figured it out up here and you can tell me how to do it, but in Minneapolis, we don't know how to have solidarity without enemies. We haven't figured that out yet. We are really good at working across lines of difference when we're in moments of crisis and we share a common enemy. We are very practiced in a collective no. And that's something very important. That's part of the fight against fascism, is a collective no, a collective refusal, the ability to withdraw our cooperation. That collective refusal can topple fascist regimes, but it's never enough to defeat fascism. So in my paid work, I'm a political scientist and I teach our social movements class at my university. And with my students, I study uprisings against authoritarian regimes and movements for democracy. And we always start our semester reading Gene Sharp and his work From Dictatorships to Democracy, and we think about the power of collective refusal together. Fascist and authoritarian regimes cannot exercise power unless we all collectively go along with it. And so we think together in my classrooms about how ordinary people, workers and students, retired folks, people from all sectors of society can collectively withdraw their cooperation. And if we're organized in our refusal and committed to supporting each other through the challenges associated with refusal long enough to harm the regime, ordinary organized people can overthrow governments that seem all-powerful. And this is one of the important lessons from Gene Sharp's work, and it's also a lesson that, like, Minneapolis seems to have learned quite well. But there's another lesson in Gene Sharp's work that we have failed to learn or don't yet seem capable of doing. And that is that it's not enough for us to collectively refuse if we want to defeat fascist authoritarians. We also have to be capable of taking power. And when you topple a regime, you have to have some coordinated movement or a united front that is actually able to step in and take power. Filling the power vacuum and refusing elites from the previous regime roles in establishing the new government. And what the Minneapolis example clearly shows is that we are not prepared to take power. We're very practiced in saying no to fascists. We're very practiced in saying no to white supremacists and cops. But we're inadequately prepared to have solidarity without an enemy. We struggle to build organizations that are capable of speaking on behalf of a movement because we aren't good at working across differences and building coalitions outside of that moment of crisis. And when I think about Minneapolis, I think a lot about Egypt in 2011, when Egyptians from so many sectors of society worked together, people who didn't necessarily have solidarity with one another typically or see themselves and their struggles as connected. So students and workers, Coptic Christians, the Muslim Brotherhood, they all were collectively refusing, and in their collective refusal, they were able to force Mubarak out. But their opposition wasn't organized to take power and to insist on democracy. And there wasn't a group that was accepted by all the factions or that could speak on behalf of all the factions. And so what ended up happening predictably was that the most organized interests in Egypt clashed for power. And so it was the military state and the Muslim Brotherhood, and there wasn't like a robust pro-democracy organization that was capable of containing all of these factions. So now the people have been able to oust Mubarak, but they still lack democracy, and they're suffering horrific violence and repression at the hands of the state because they were prepared to refuse, but they weren't prepared to take power. And I think that we're somewhere very similar in the United States. There are people all over the country who are collectively refusing fascism. This week, our comrades in New Jersey are putting themselves at risk to oppose the deportation regime and our fascist administration. And it is beautiful and necessary work that they are doing. And even if people were to refuse en masse all over the country, even if we somehow managed a general strike, non-cooperation at a massive scale, what is the group that would be capable of standing up a new government? And I think that that has to be the demand if we're serious about defeating fascism: refusal until the US government falls. So it's not enough to withdraw consent from the Trump administration and allow the Democrats to take power. The Democrats will never defeat fascism because they're committed to capitalism over democracy. And when it comes to the drivers of fascism globally, neoliberalism, imperialism, deepening inequality, migration forced due to economic predation by the global north, and climate collapse, which is also largely caused by the global north, the Democrats are nearly indistinguishable from Republicans. They will never defeat fascism because what they want is fascism without the spectacle. They want bureaucratic or administrative fascism, deportation and exploitation done the right way or through the appropriate channels and the right legal procedures. And my concern right now about where we are in the United States is that we're so singly focused on refusing Trump that we are not preparing adequately to take power. We're not building a movement for democracy or the onions bill that you were talking about. We're not really adequately focused on building that infrastructure. We're just focused on defeating Trump. And until we're going to build what Bill was talking about earlier this evening, we're not prepared to take power. And I think if we're serious about defeating fascism, that has to be our goal. So, thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Merci beaucoup, Kathleen, pour cette réflexion vraiment précise et honnête sur les défis de la mobilisation. Pour notre dernière panéliste, on va se transposer dans le contexte québécois, donc celui qui est le nôtre, avant d'ouvrir à la conversation avec la salle. Bon, Julie, ça fait plusieurs années que tu t'investis dans le mouvement communautaire. Est-ce que tu pourrais nous parler, d'une part, selon toi, de ta perspective, quelles sont les manifestations de la montée de l'extrême droite au Québec et surtout, quels sont les leviers dont on bénéficie sur le plan de l'action communautaire, mais aussi plus largement?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci de m'avoir invité ce soir sur ce panel. J'avoue que j'étais très intimidée d'être là à côté de toutes ces belles personnes. Donc, je vais prendre juste un petit moment pour vous parler du MEPAC. Là, on sait, grosso modo, ça a été dit en introduction, c'est un regroupement national multisectoriel. Nous, on fait de l'éducation populaire autonome. Puis c'est ça, nos membres, dans le fond, c'est des tables régionales qui, elles, ont des groupes locaux qui sont membres. Les groupes locaux sont de tous les secteurs. Il y a des groupes locaux qui sont des groupes de femmes, des groupes LGBTQ+, on a des groupes de logement, chômage, personnalité sociale. Vraiment, c'est de tous les horizons. Mais qu'est-ce qui les relie, tous ces groupes-là? C'est qu'ils font toute l'éducation populaire autonome et pour la grande majorité d'entre eux, ils font partie du secteur de la défense collective des droits. La défense collective des droits au Québec, c'est un secteur qui est quand même particulier. Nous, notre mission, c'est vraiment de défendre les droits sociaux. Puis on a, dans notre mission, puis on est reconnu comme ça, c'est de critiquer le gouvernement. Ça en fait partie. Puis ça, je vais y revenir un petit peu plus tard aussi. Donc, souvent, on pense que dans le communautaire, on est là pour donner des services. Oui, il y a des organismes qui donnent des services, mais au MEPAC, parmi les membres, il y en a qui donnent des services, mais le but ultime, c'est vraiment la transformation sociale par l'éducation populaire autonome. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? C'est de dire que les personnes qui viennent dans les organismes prennent conscience ensemble des inégalités qu'elles vivent, des injustices qu'elles vivent, puis ensuite se disent, mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire ensemble pour transformer notre société, pour enrayer ultimement ces inégalités-là? Fait que c'est ça l'éducation populaire autonome. Fait qu'on va faire toutes sortes d'actions politiques ensemble qu'on va imaginer, du plaidoyer auprès des élus. On va aller faire une action dérangeante, on va organiser une manifestation, on va, faire de la sensibilisation. Fait que ça fait toute partie du processus d'éducation populaire autonome. Donc, tous les groupes pas tous les... Beaucoup de groupes au MEPAC ont remarqué justement qu'il y avait une recrudescence du fascisme et de l'extrême droite au Québec, que c'était de plus en plus visible aussi dans l'espace public. Puis ça l'a mené, dans le fond, le MEPAC, dans le fond, l'équipe au national, de créer 2 guides pour reconnaître les discours d'extrême droite autour de nous. On en a publié 2 dans la dernière année. Fait que c'est quelque chose qui nous préoccupe beaucoup. Il y a un guide, j'en ai apporté quelques copies avec moi si jamais il y en a que ça intéresse. Sinon, vous pouvez les trouver gratuitement sur notre site web. Donc, il y en a un qui est plus étoffé, qui est comme démystifier l'extrême droite. On l'a fait en collaboration avec le MEPAL, qui est la table d'éducation populaire autonome à la Naudière. Puis un autre qui est plus court, plus imagé. On l'appelle affectueusement le guide des fruits pourris parce que le titre, c'est « Les idées, c'est comme les fruits, ça pourrit ». C'est un guide sur la montée des discours toxiques d'extrême droite. Celui-là, on l'a fait en collaboration avec le groupe de recherche et de formation sur la pauvreté au Québec. C'est un membre auxiliaire du MEPAC, puis il est sur notre comité éducation populaire. Donc, ceci dit, j'avais peut-être plus envie de vous parler des manifestations du fascisme puis de l'extrême droite dans les politiques gouvernementales, dans les projets de loi, puis les lois, en fait, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de projets de loi qui ont été adoptés récemment. Vous savez qu'on a été inondés de projets de loi dans la dernière année. Je ne vous apprends rien. C'est allé tellement vite. Il y en a un qui était déposé, on n'avait pas le temps de l'étudier, qu'il y en avait un autre qui arrivait, puis un autre. Donc, on a remarqué, un peu comme les autres panélistes, dans le fond, le fascisme vient avec, d'une part, l'autoritarisme, la répression, puis d'un autre côté, des attaques aux droits et libertés. Puis ça, on retrouve ça dans beaucoup de projets de loi, ces deux aspects-là. Donc, pour qu'est-ce qui est des attaques aux droits et libertés, souvent, ça vient aussi avec l'idée de protection comme d'une identité ou d'un intérêt national. C'est jamais trop défini c'est quoi notre intérêt national, mais on veut le protéger vraiment avec ferveur. C'est bien important de protéger ça, même si on ne sait pas exactement c'est quoi. Donc, on attaque, c'est ça, les droits et libertés. Puis, évidemment, on commence par des groupes qui sont les plus vulnérabilisés. Fait qu'on a vu les droits des personnes immigrantes qui ont été attaqués avec, la fin abrupte du PEQ, du programme d'expérience québécoise. Là, ça se complique beaucoup de ce côté-là. Les femmes qui portent le voile ont été attaquées aussi avec le projet de loi 9 qui élargit, dans le fond, l'interdiction de port de signes religieux là, dans les services de l'État. C'est une loi qui a précédemment été adoptée, là, la loi sur la laïcité. Fait qu'on vient élargir ça. On vient attaquer aussi les personnes trans, non-binaires et créatives dans le genre parce qu'on a mis à jour la politique linguistique de l'État. Puis là, maintenant, on interdit l'écriture inclusive à tous les fonctionnaires. Donc, c'est le fait d'attaquer comme ça aussi frontalement puis aussi publiquement, de front, dans le fond, les droits et libertés, ça a comme effet de diviser. Ça fomente la haine et ça normalise la discrimination. Donc, la classe politique, quand elle met en place des projets de loi qui sont ouvertement discriminatoires comme ça, ou quand elle tient des discours ouvertement discriminatoires dans l'espace public, comme on a entendu beaucoup dans les 2-3 dernières années, la crise du logement, c'est la faute des personnes immigrantes. Là. Si on l'a entendu, ça fait des décennies qu'il y a une crise du logement au Québec, mais là, soudainement, c'est de la faute des personnes qui viennent d'arriver ici. Donc, ça augmente la haine dans la population. Puis, on a eu un exemple de ça, pas plus tard qu'en fin de semaine à Shawinigan. Il y a eu une manifestation, dans le fond, pour un Québec blanc. Heureusement, il y a eu une réponse à ça, mais c'est quand même arrivé. Donc, c'est comme si quand dans les discours publics ou les discours officiels se permettent d'être discriminatoires, mais ça ouvre la porte à ce genre de choses-là. L'autre aspect, justement, la tendance à l'autoritarisme et à la répression, on le voit aussi dans d'autres projets de loi qui ont déferlé sur le Québec. Beaucoup d'entre eux ont été adoptés. Là. On a attaqué les syndicats pour les empêcher de mener des luttes sociales. Les syndicats sont un contre-pouvoir important dans notre société. C'est des grosses machines. Ils ont beaucoup de moyens, ils ont de la capacité. Puis quand ils s'investissent dans des luttes, ils sont très vocaux et on leur accorde aussi, ils ont une grande crédibilité. Fait que quand ils se mettent à bouger, puis aussi, quand ils viennent aussi appuyer le communautaire, ça donne un gros poids à nos luttes. Il y a eu le projet de loi 89, on a attaqué le droit de grève, soi-disant pour protéger le bien-être de la population. On a attaqué le droit de manifester avec le PL13. Ça attaque aussi directement les groupes militants parce qu'on a donné au corps policier plus de droits, en fait, pendant les manifestations. Pas plus de droits, mais plus excusez, je cherche mes mots. En fait, comme plus de pouvoir à la police, comme un droit de fouille sans nécessairement avoir de mandat sur les personnes pendant les manifestations. Donc, ça ouvre la porte à justement, un profilage politique et de toutes sortes. Il y a eu aussi, puis ça, c'est quand même intéressant si on veut, parce qu'au fédéral et au provincial, il y a eu dans la dernière année des projets de loi qui ont dit on va accélérer la mise en œuvre de grands projets qui sont d'intérêt national. Encore là, l'intérêt national n'est pas nécessairement défini, mais on s'entend qu'il faut lire entre les lignes que c'est pour couper court aux évaluations environnementales qui ont lieu puis qui leur mettent un peu des bâtons dans les roues et pour couper court aussi aux protestations citoyennes. Donc, on veut que les grands projets, que les gouvernements disent, bien ça, c'est bon pour notre société, comme des beaux pipelines qui vont traverser le Canada, bien ça, on accélère, puis là, on veut que ça se fasse au plus vite. Donc, on veut taire un peu tous les contre-pouvoirs ou la contestation qui pourrait émerger avant même qu'elle émerge, en fait. Il y a aussi le projet de constitution. il faut le mettre entre gros guillemets, là. C'est parce que c'est tout sauf une constitution. Celui-là, il n'est pas encore adopté. Vous pouvez encore agir sur ce point-là. Il y a la Ligue des droits et libertés qui travaille là-dessus. Fait que si vous allez sur leur site, vous pouvez encore, c'est ça, faire une action là, pour empêcher son adoption qui pourrait avoir lieu d'ici le 12 juin. Mais ce projet-là, en fait, il vient nier les droits territoriaux des peuples autochtones. Il établit aussi un drôle d'affaire qui est comme la notion d'intérêt de la nation. C'est comme des espèces de droits collectifs qui vont primer, que c'est un peu intouchable, que si on dit qu'il y a une loi ou un projet de loi qui est d'intérêt de la nation, on ne pourra pas la contester devant les tribunaux. Fait que là, ça vient affaiblir tout le recours à la Charte des droits et libertés et le recours aux tribunaux, qui sont encore là des contre-pouvoirs super importants dans notre société. Pour terminer là-dessus, le communautaire a aussi été attaqué dans son rôle de contre-pouvoir. Puis là, j'avoue que j'étais un peu insultée parce que c'est dans un projet de loi pour réduire la bureaucratie et améliorer l'efficacité de l'État. Je me suis dit, on était une petite pinotte dans ce grand projet de loi, mais ça voulait dire énormément pour nous parce qu'on vient toucher, en fait, à notre enveloppe de financement. Comme je vous disais, le secteur de la défense collective des droits, là, on est là pour défendre les droits sociaux et ça vient avec critiquer le gouvernement. La façon qu'on est financé en ce moment, il y a une saine distance qui nous permet de faire ça sans jamais risquer de perdre notre financement. Notre financement est récurrent, il est à la mission globale, puis on est reconnu par l'État comme tel, comme étant des personnes qui peuvent contester. On vient prendre maintenant, avec la fusion, avec cette espèce de projet de loi-là, on fusionne notre enveloppe de financement avec une autre qui, elle, est par projet. On la met côte à côte avec une autre qui est par projet, qu'on contrôle beaucoup plus, on dit, dans le fond, c'est le gouvernement qui dit dans quoi on va mettre de l'argent et non l'inverse pour nous dans le communautaire quand on est payé à justement des subventions à la mission globale. C'est nous qui déterminons notre mission de façon autonome. Là, c'est l'inverse. On les met côte à côte puis on dit, il y a de l'argent qui va pouvoir transiter des deux côtés, mais inquiétez-vous pas, c'est juste pour mettre plus d'argent à la mission. Bon, voilà, mais ça, c'est écrit nulle part. Donc, ce projet de loi-là vient vraiment fragiliser le mouvement communautaire, dans le fond, toute l'action communautaire autonome au Québec telle qu'elle est conçue. Puis c'est très précieux comme modèle parce que ça n'existe pas partout ailleurs. C'est assez unique comme modèle. Donc là, c'est pas mal ça dans quoi on se trouve. C'est le contexte actuel. On le sent, le vent de droite qui souffle. Je pense que dans les dernières décennies, il y a eu quand même, les mouvements sociaux ont fait des grandes avancées. Je pense aux droits des femmes avec, par exemple, le mouvement MeToo, les droits des personnes LGBTQ+, avec la reconnaissance aussi des identités non-binaires. Donc, il y a quand même des avancées qui ont été faites. Puis là, la vague d'avancées nous mène à un ressac. Là, on est vraiment pris dans le ressac. C'est pas beau. Il va être long, le ressac. Puis, il n'a pas fini d'être trash. Il a déjà commencé à être trash, puis il va continuer à l'être. Puis, ce n'est pas les élections qui s'en viennent à l'automne qui vont changer ça. Le contexte va rester le même. Peu importe qui va être élu, ça n'ira pas mieux parce qu'on est vraiment dans cette espèce de ressac-là de droite, puis ça va influencer tout le reste. Puis, face à ça, en fait, au MEPAC, on fait beaucoup d'assemblées générales. Puis, à notre dernière assemblée générale, en mars, nos membres nous ont mandaté de développer un large mouvement de résistance sociale et populaire avec nos alliés. Genre faire la révolution. Genre. Fait que la première étape de cette révolution, c'est que le MEPAC appelle avec ses alliés à une semaine d'action et de grève régionale sous le thème, là, il y a des belles rimes, vous allez voir ça, « Contre la vie chère, les attaques autoritaires et le climat précaire, la riposte sera populaire. » On aime beaucoup ça. Donc, ça va avoir lieu du 25 septembre au 3 octobre. Et le 3 octobre, on vous invite à converger vers la mobilisation étudiante qui va avoir lieu. C'était vraiment, vraiment important pour nous, au MEPAC, de s'arrimer d'abord avec le mouvement étudiant. Le mouvement étudiant, depuis la pandémie, il y a eu vraiment une espèce de déstructuration, parce que la pandémie, avec l'isolement puis les cours en ligne, je pense qu'on sent qu'il y a eu une perte un peu de transmission de la militance, puis en étant isolés, chacune chez soi, puis après ça, comme tout ce qui se passe dans l'informel, on n'a pas accès à ça. Fait que je pense que ça a déstructuré un peu le mouvement qui s'est reconstruit et qui, là, recommence à se mobiliser, puis se mobilise de plus en plus. Fait que pour nous, c'est super important de soutenir ces mobilisations-là, puis de soutenir ce mouvement-là, parce que le mouvement étudiant est vraiment un des piliers importants de la résistance au Québec. Puis, on va se le dire, là, on va quand même un petit peu se lancer des fleurs, là, parce que quand le mouvement étudiant, le communautaire, les syndicats, les mouvements citoyens, quand tout le monde se met ensemble, on en fait bouger des choses. Comme c'est sûr qu'on en fait bouger des choses. Mais pour en arriver là, ben, il faut commencer ou recommencer à travailler ensemble. Parce que là, pour nous, en fait, au MEPAC, ça passe par l'action collective, ça passe par la mobilisation. Ça passe aussi par le local puis le régional. Nous, notre travail au national, c'est plus de faire un chapeau puis de faire en sorte que les actions politiques puis toutes les mobilisations, puis ce qui va émerger de la base, rentrent, dans le fond, s'inscrivent dans un tout, puis essayer de faire en sorte qu'on fasse mouvement ensemble. Fait que ce qu'on vous propose, c'est vraiment de faire un premier pas vers quelque chose de plus large. Il y a déjà des liens qui existent. Fait que construisons à partir de ça une base qui est solide pour avoir un mouvement qui va durer dans le temps. Puis c'est ça aussi l'éducation populaire autonome. C'est un travail de fond. C'est un travail qui est lent, mais qui nous amène, dans le fond, à transformer notre société vers plus de justice sociale. On a tout le sentiment d'urgence, puis l'espèce de sentiment d'impuissance, puis de se sentir envahi par tout ce qui se passe. Puis c'est normal parce que c'est comme s'il y avait plein de petits feux à éteindre en même temps, puis là, on ne sait plus trop donner de la tête. Ça, c'est parce qu'ils ont quand même très bien réussi à nous diviser, puis à nous épuiser. Parce que dans le fond, on essaie chacun d'éteindre notre petit feu dans notre coin, mais là, en même temps, on veut être solidaire des autres, mais on n'a pas l'énergie et la capacité de tout faire ça en même temps. Fait que là, on n'a plus, dans le fond, on ne peut plus se permettre de rester cantonné dans notre secteur à essayer d'éteindre notre petit feu à nous puis à travailler là-dessus. Parce que derrière tous ces petits feux-là, bien, qu'est-ce qu'il y a? C'est la droite, c'est le fascisme, c'est le capitalisme, c'est le 1 %, même si c'est une pure invention des mouvements Occupy. C'est le 1 % qui trache notre planète, c'est le 1 % qui trache nos droits. Puis c'est ces mêmes personnes-là qui créent le chaos puis qui en profitent. Puis c'est les mêmes personnes qui en subissent les conséquences. Puis ça fait trop longtemps que ça dure. Là, c'est le temps que nous, on prenne un pas de recul, on s'organise ensemble. Puis ça commence à l'automne avec vous.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Julie. Sur ce, étant donné qu'on a pris un peu de retard au début de l'événement, on passerait dès maintenant aux interventions et aux questions de la salle. Je vous invite à être concise quand même dans l'énoncé de vos questions pour qu'on ait le temps d'en poser le plus possible. Donc, je vous invite à vous rendre au micro. Alors, on a une personne ici au micro.
Thank you to the panelists. I'm going to speak in English for our guests who come from the States. Thank you so much to the panelists. I just beg to differ about the fascism is not something that falls from the heavens. In whose interest is this fascism? Who is behind it? The oligarchs who own the media and the think tanks, and they own the universities, they own everything. They've been cannibalizing our societies for the past 40 years. They are the culprits, and you have to point them out. It's not enough to talk about fascism. Who is behind? In whose interest is this fascism? Somebody is behind it. And it's in what they do best, you know, they've been doing that for years, divide and conquer. Divide and conquer so that they can keep the citizens away from each other, away from solidarity, away from understanding who is oppressing them. And then the arrogance of the billionaires who are not satisfied with influencing governments. They now want to be the government. They think that the world will collapse without them, without their input. They think they're geniuses, and therefore they think they're the ones who deserve to govern. And they're openly against democracy. They're openly against people, whether it's Musk or Bezos. Bezos came here, you remember, when he came here, and the workers decided to have a union. He shut down the warehouse. So name the culprits. The culprits have a name. They're the billionaires who are oppressing us and taking away our freedoms, and name them. It's not enough to say fascism. Fascism is not something that falls from the skies. That's just my comment.
Merci. Thank you. On pourrait prendre dès maintenant la prochaine question, puis ensuite, si vous voudrez réagir, je vous passerai, oui, à l'autre.
Yeah, hello. In English again, so Kathleen. So you mentioned Egypt 2011. So I wanted to have to comment on this. So I'm Tunisian, so I know better the Tunisian context. So after the revolution, we had, of course, some kind of demobilization. But the reason, the biggest reason is imperialism. It's not because people were only against the dictatorship and then they were not able to organize. So economically, we were not supported. It's even the opposite. There were political assassinations of major figures from the left. And also the youth that participated in the revolution were used by different NGOs, you know, to go into the civil society and so on. So this is a very structured, you know, way of doing that doesn't really help us organize. So I think there is that dimension that we shouldn't be forgetting when we talk about we don't have the same enemy anymore. And I have a question for you, and I'm in fact very curious because I heard you talking about that the situation where people cannot mobilize if they're not against Trump or, you know, their movement. So it seemed also personal, like the way you were talking about it. So I'm interested in knowing why do you think we? I mean, I understand we need to go to to organize in politics and so on, but at the same time, if we still have a common enemy, right? We cannot stop now, right? So I'm curious about your process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your comment and understand that both the Egyptian case and also Tunisia is much more complicated than I can summarize in, you know, a 90-second piece of the talk. You know, I think one of the problems that is very clear in Minneapolis across the different networks is that we had minimal shared agreements. So just to speak about the network that I helped to build and coordinate with some neighbors, our agreements were that we understand that ICE is a threat to our communities and we must take action to stop them. And that we were going to assume that all of our communications were either public or potentially public and subject to police surveillance. And those were the two things that everybody agreed to. And I think what makes it really difficult is that because we were organizing in a crisis, because we were organizing in response to this threat, it wasn't like there was this shared agreement about principles of democracy, right? There were people in our group that are, you know, there are people who are anarchists, there are people who are abolitionists, there's normie Democrats who are just very anti-Trump. There isn't this shared set of values, there isn't a shared conception of the good or you know, the goal that we're trying to get to. And because we're organizing in moments of crisis, you know, trying to do a bunch of public education around like, you know, what does a vision of democracy look like, and like collaboratively generate that vision, it's not on anybody's priority list at that point. And so we have this like group of people that are hyper-focused on responding to this like very real violent threat in our communities, who don't share values, who, you know, many of those folks would be very happy to go back to the Democrats being in power and the Biden regime's deportation practices, right? And so I think understanding that, you know, when all we're good at is kind of like mobilizing in response to crisis, we're not going to be able to build the kind of infrastructure that we need to be able to like keep people disciplined and focused on the threat, even when the nature of the threat changes, right? Because if they're not committed to this idea of establishing an actual democracy in the United States rather than like liberal capitalism, if they're not actually like committed to that, then the moment that this spectacular violence of the Trump administration leaves, people go back to their regular lives and want to, I don't know, what do people do? Do they watch Netflix? And I don't know. But that's it. I mean, and so I think that that's really the problem, is that like we're very good at bringing people in these moments of crisis, but we're not doing the work of like establishing the kind of like autonomous popular education projects that we need to build like awareness that we actually need a movement for democracy in the United States, that the Democrats reclaiming power is just like a slower version. It's like fascist creep, but it's not like they're never going to stop these people. They don't want to, because they're accountable to the same groups that these fascists are. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Il y avait une autre question de ce côté-ci, si vous voulez.
Hello. Thank you all for such amazing, inspiring speeches that you've all made. Maybe just to briefly position myself, I am a Peruvian American, and I do want to say some stuff here. I do believe, just a commentary, you know? So I do believe strongly that we can all unite in alliances, you know, globally. Thinking about Latin America, the global South, hearing, Aparna Sundar talk a lot about all the situation, it kind of resonated with me, because I have seen that back at home as well in Peru. And I do believe that, of course, we do not have a caste system, but there are similarities in the global South. And I think that it is important to also learn from each other and unite all of us that have these similar views with l'éducation popular, and also, you know, we also have all those, all these ideas that we can agree on. I do believe strongly in that, and I hope that we can move forward also. Thank you very much.
Merci. Yeah, please react. Sorry. Mine?
No? Are they all just not? Hello. I just wanted to say that that today's, you know, this some of us have been here as part of a kind of organizing of a global network of solidarity against fascism. So this was organized or hosted by Alternatives, but there were members from 12 different countries in Asia. So there's the Philippines, India, Sri Lanka, the people from Morocco, Morocco, the Sudan, and from Brazil and Ecuador, and of course from the United States and Canada. And this was the understanding that there are, in fact, emerging forms of far-right politics, authoritarianism, and fascism across all of these contexts, and there's much we can learn from each other and strategize. But in addition to that, we are all working within the same kind of global order in which we've seen this kind of live broadcast genocide, the failure of international institutions to stop it, and the kind of rapid movement towards an ecological crisis. So there are these kinds of movements or this coming together that's very important, and I really appreciate what you've said, but just wanted to share the fact that this network is also being built.
I wanted to respond to the person that was saying the thing about that fascism doesn't fall from the sky. I also wanted to raise something about what Kathleen raised. I didn't hear anyone here suggest that it falls from the sky. So maybe I wasn't listening or something. But what was being said is that fascism is not something that is simply manipulated by some puppeteers up here that are maneuvering people. In every racial settler state, in every state where there has been imperialism and colonialism, the germ of fascism exists. Doesn't necessarily mean it emerges, it's a cancer. But it exists. The movement in the United States is not simply about Trump or Musk or Thiel. In 1964 and 65, white people started leaving the Democratic Party. This is before neoliberalism. They started leaving the Democratic Party and going to the Republican Party because of the victories of the Black freedom movement. That transition laid the foundations for eventually the Tea Party and for MAGA. This did not pop out of nowhere. But there is a particular kind of alliance, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, that exists between certain segments of capital and this movement. But the problem is when you simply focus on those elements of capital, you're ignoring millions and millions of people who have lost their humanity and are ready to wipe out everybody in this room. And we cannot afford to do that. We just can't afford to do it. We've got to understand this at the level of strategy. The one point I would disagree with you slightly, Kathleen, is this. See, I don't think that the Democrats are promoting fascism. I don't think that they're prepared to fight it. There's a difference. I don't think that they know how to fight it. Because, see, part of the problem with talk about the Democratic establishment, because the Democratic Party is not really a party, but the Democratic establishment, one of the things about the Democratic establishment is that they actually hate the fascists, but they fear us, right? And that presents a strategic dilemma for them. This is not just true in the US. We could see this in the 1930s. In many countries, that there is this ambivalence within ruling circles that may not be in support of fascism, but they are deeply afraid of the left. They're deeply afraid of the popular movements. And the question is whether or not some of them can be convinced that it is in their interest to align with us against the fascists, as opposed to them aligning with the fascists against us.
On va avoir le temps de prendre une, maximum 2 questions. Fait que je poursuis l'alternance de micro. Oui.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour cette organisation. Et je vais essayer de poser ma question en anglais parce que je vais adresser à Kathleen Cole. You mentioned taking power, but I just found maybe it's because of the speech has to be short, so I just found a bit abstract. What do you mean by taking power? Not to prepare to taking power, the people is not prepared to take the power. How do you define the power? And what will you do with power after that? Thanks.
Thanks for your question. And it actually gives me a little bit of an opportunity to respond to Bill. Because I don't think that you can have democracy in the United States without establishing a new government. And I don't think that the Democrats are really in meaningful ways opposed to fascism. And kind of, you know, Bill, the analogy that you used of like cancer spreading, right? You know, the Democrats are imperialists. The Democrats are committed to capitalism over people and planet. And they have shown that repeatedly. And so to me, the idea that, yeah, I mean, do they, you know, oppose, you know, the spectacle of violence sometimes, but, you know, the Biden administration and the Trump administration are deporting, you know, roughly the same number of people. We have like their commitment to neoliberalism and dismantling democracy and installing dictatorships in other countries. I mean, to me, the seed is there, and saying that we can cooperate with a Democratic Party that is, you know, going to do capital's bidding, to me seems to me seems like just delaying the inevitable, because they have been complicit with the rise of fascism, and they will continue to be complicit. And until there is a social organization that is willing to stand for democracy that is not liberal democracy and that doesn't prioritize capitalism over people and planet, to me, I just think that like our movements have to be imagining a world after capitalism, after like a new constitution. Like we cannot, the structure of the US government is so fundamentally unequal and will reproduce inequalities. And so to me, when I talk about taking power, I mean, we have to have movements that have at the center of their vision the establishment of a new government in the United States, an anti-imperialist, democratic, socialist government that is not interested in continuing the policies that, you know, as you say, that have that cancer at their core, because it will grow. I mean, these people are not, they have allowed it to grow because it was useful to them. And so to me, when I talk about taking power, what I'm talking about is movements that insist that it's not enough to get Trump out and to put Democrats in power. Neither of these parties can have power. And we have a single member district plurality system in the United States. Our electoral system does not allow us to have this, like, you know, third party option or multi-party system. We have, because we have SMDP tied to presidentialism, like we get two options and they're both terrible. And we should be saying no to both of them. Personally. And so, like, I'm happy to work with, you know, a united front, but I'm only happy to do so if we're thinking about, like, what would an actual democracy that meets the needs of ordinary people look like? And if the answer is the Democrats being in power, I don't think that that's actually addressing the fundamental inequalities of our system.
Thank you. Maybe one, peut-être une dernière question. Pardon? Les deux. Ouais, ben, je suis désolée. Ouais, c'est rapide, on verra.
Thank you. First, thank you all for this panel. A lot of the discussion has been around unity, unifying, united fronts, convergence, which is also the topic of the group that called for this panel. And it just reminded me of the fact that there's been no shortage, at least here, of discussions over the last few months or years about the need to converge, to come together. There's most of organization of the, like, institutional left, or like everything that is like larger organizations, unions, community orgs, students, have been having meetings and talks on the need to come together and do something. But it's really hard for me to see how, at least at this point, this has manifested in actual mobilization and actual resistance and actions. There seem to have been little constructive and actual power to be able to fight the enemy. Lots of talks, a lot of consensus around the fact that we need to come together and have discussions. But there's been it seems to me that there's been some unwillingness to put in danger the security of organization to benefit the fight against fascism. I'm curious how this manifests in the US, where there is less of a structured left than in Quebec. And further down, how can we compose the powerful movements against fascism in a certain context, or so much of our most powerful allies seems to have doubt about their willingness to take actions concretely when it could involve some risk for themselves and could involve some tarnishing of their image. And as a counterexample to the discussion, I was in Paris during September 10 last fall, the Block Everything movement, and there I saw unionist, communist, anarchist, autonomous, members of institutional leftist political parties in the streets blocking police charges to blockade the economy of their country. And I'm curious if it's possible there, why can it not be here in North America and outside of context of defending against an immediate threat, which seem to be a context where people are willing to take more risks.
Je propose qu'on prenne tout de suite la deuxième question très rapidement, puis après vous pourrez réagir. Ça vous...
Ouais, donc je vais être assez rapide. D'abord, je voudrais remercier les intervenantes et les intervenants, particulièrement Julie, parce que tu nous as parlé du Québec, et moi, c'est ce que j'attendais, et surtout parce que tu nous as fait une proposition concrète à la fin. Et ça, pour moi, c'est important. Ensuite, je voulais dire une chose, c'est que il me semble que faire d'antifascisme, c'est quand même aussi une lutte spécifique. C'est un sujet particulier, et il faut l'aborder, et je voulais proposer peut-être 2 pistes de réflexion. Alors, avec quelque chose de concret, grosso modo, bon, sur le terrain, il y a des gens qui vont y aller. Vous avez par exemple le Front Pop qui s'est organisé, je pense que vous êtes au courant. Vous avez aussi pas mal de groupes jeunes antifa qui ont envie d'y aller sur le terrain. La rue, ils vont s'en occuper. Il reste pour moi l'autre aspect, c'est-à-dire les discours. Et ça, moi, je proposerais 2 choses. Il y a les médias. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire par rapport aux médias ? Et ça pourrait être un groupe de travail, si vous avez envie que des gens s'organisent et fassent quelque chose par rapport à ça. Un exemple tout simple, vous avez un mec qui traîne au Québec, qui s'appelle Mathieu Bocoté depuis des années, c'est un fasciste. Ce mec, il n'a rien à foutre sur les radios publiques et dans les journaux. Voilà, ça c'est clair, c'est concret. Deuxième piste, que je proposerais comme base de travail, et si des gens là aussi veulent travailler, où il y a bientôt des élections, on sait, comme tu l'as rappelé, qu'il y a un discours de plus en plus qui s'installe, et quelqu'un l'a dit d'ailleurs beaucoup mieux que moi, c'est Haroun Bouazi, un discours qui se construit et qui fait que de plus en plus, on met l'autre de côté. Donc ça nous prépare à quelque chose, et ça, c'est du fascisme et du racisme. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait par rapport à ça ? Comment on intervient ? Comment on s'organise ? Les élections arrivent, il ne faut pas attendre le dernier moment, il faut y aller, il faut les contrer, il faut s'organiser pour ça. C'est la deuxième piste que je propose. Et pour conclure, je dirais simplement que concrètement, plus on fait des choses, plus on est efficace et plus on leur enlève la parole, plus on lance l'élu social, plus c'est important. Et là, ça rejoint ce que tu nous as proposé. Voilà, c'est tout ce que je voulais vous dire. Merci à vous.
Merci. Est-ce que vous vouliez réagir? Julie, peut-être?
Oui. Ben, peut-être un peu sur les 2 questions. Merci pour vos questions, commentaires. En fait, sur la question de comment ça émerge, est-ce que ça émerge réellement, cette espèce de convergence? Je pense que le fascisme, justement, ça nous fait nous replier chacun sur nous-mêmes puis sur notre secteur. Au MEPAC, on est un regroupement multisectoriel, puis même les tables régionales nous disent « Ah, c'est difficile. Dans les dernières années, c'est super difficile parce que chaque secteur est attaqué et donc chaque secteur se bat un peu pour son propre, comme soit sa survie, soit, tu sais, même nous, là, quand le projet de loi qui touchait notre enveloppe de financement est arrivé, moi, j'étais sur j'allais mettre de l'énergie sur PL1, le projet de constitution, puis je me suis dit, mais je peux pas faire les deux. Fait que je me replie sur mon secteur, puis c'est un peu la survie de du mouvement de l'action communautaire autonome comme on la connaît. Fait qu'on se fait diviser un peu comme ça. Fait que c'est sûr que c'est difficile, après ça, de faire des solidarités puis de justement trouver cette énergie-là pour se solidariser entre nous. Mais il y en a des exemples. Je ne sais pas s'il y en a qui ont participé, dans le fond, qui étaient présents au 1er mai. Le 1er mai, c'était des actions régionales. Il y a eu vraiment un travail qui a été fait entre les secteurs. Le mouvement étudiant était là. Il y avait des organismes militants, antifascistes, anticapitalistes. Il y avait justement le communautaire qui était là. Il y avait le mouvement des sans-emploi. Il y avait vraiment de toutes sortes d'organisations. Puis ça a été... fait que je pense que c'est dans des... Pour nous, en tout cas, au MEPAC, c'est vraiment, ça passe dans les mobilisations, puis ça passe dans ces actions-là qu'on tisse des liens entre nous, puis que petit à petit, ça ne se construira pas du jour au lendemain. C'est pas parce que, justement, on fait notre mobilisation, par exemple, à l'automne, que là, le gouvernement va dire « Ah, ben oui, on va arrêter d'être raciste. » Tu sais, comme ça ne se fera pas du jour au lendemain, mais dans le sens qu'on va tranquillement construire ces ponts-là entre nous, puis faire en sorte que si on s'est déjà organisé une fois ensemble, la fois d'après, ben c'est plus facile, c'est plus rapide, puis on est capable justement de monter un discours qui va contrer le fascisme qu'on entend, puis on va devenir de plus en plus gros, de plus en plus fort, puis de plus en plus présent, justement. Fait qu'à la question, justement, des discours, que je voulais dire, j'ai perdu mon idée, zut. Je vais laisser la parole peut-être à quelqu'un d'autre. J'ai comme oublié ce que je voulais dire.
Est-ce qu'un d'entre vous voulait réagir pour avoir le mot de la fin? Non? Sinon, c'est ton idée. Désolée.
Oh non, il y a trop de pression. On est là. Mais je pense que c'est ça. Ça peut vraiment émerger. J'essaie de voir. Ben oui, c'est ça que je voulais dire. Oui, c'est revenu. OK. On parlait des élections. Puis justement, les dates du 25 septembre au 3 octobre, c'est pas anodin parce que c'est vraiment juste avant les élections. Le mouvement communautaire, il y a plein d'autres groupes dans le communautaire qui veulent se mobiliser à ce temps-là, justement pour se faire entendre, puis pour faire entendre que c'est ça, les élections n'y changeront rien, puis essayer de contrer ces discours-là, parce qu'on le sait qu'on va les entendre, les discours racistes, les discours discriminatoires, on sait qu'ils vont faire partie de l'espace public. Fait que c'est là, on veut prendre cet espace-là, puis on veut justement émettre ce contre-discours-là, puis être présent, puis dire que c'est pas ça qu'on veut pour la suite. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Bien, sur ça, je vous inviterai à donner une chaleureuse main d'applaudissement à nos panélistes. Zaya va dire quelques mots, mais avant, je voulais dire un remerciement tout particulier à Gilda et Isabelle qui se sont occupées de la traduction simultanée tout au long de l'événement. Là, ça a dû quand même être un sacré défi, donc merci beaucoup, beaucoup. Merci à toutes les personnes militantes et bénévoles qui ont rendu la soirée de ce soir possible. Merci à vous pour votre généreuse participation. Puis simplement vous rappeler aussi que lundi, le 8 juin, il y aura un autre événement dans la série organisé par l'Observatoire pour la justice migrante à l'invitation du Festival Transamérique. Donc, si vous avez l'occasion d'y passer au quartier général du FTA, le panel est intitulé « Lutter contre la fascisation du monde à partir des marges » avec les panélistes que vous voyez ici de manière opportune derrière moi. Donc, voilà, merci beaucoup. Et Zaya, je te laisse le mot de la fin.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Effectivement, je voulais juste prendre quelques minutes pour vous remercier. Tous les panélistes, Bill, Aparna, Kathleen, Julie, Aurélie, vraiment merci beaucoup. Au nom de la Mosaïque des résistances, je veux aussi prendre un moment pour remercier le comité de pilotage et d'organisation de l'événement de la Mosaïque des résistances. Oui, effectivement, il faut les applaudir parce que c'était un travail acharné. Puis comme on s'est dit, tout le monde l'a manifesté, on veut se laisser avec des événements. Il y a une panoplie des événements. Il y a un événement demain, effectivement, vous l'avez mentionné, concernant un atelier pour contrer, démystifier l'extrême droite. Il y a un événement aussi le 5 juin avec la Ligue des droits et des libertés pour le lancement de leur revue. Il y a un événement alternatif aussi, défis auxquels font face les groupes de la société civile dans le Sud global. L'événement de 8 juin dont vous avez parlé, Aurélie. Le 12 juin, l'événement Braise, le grand rassemblement annuel du mouvement Multitude. Donc, ce n'est pas les événements et les mouvements qui manquent. Il faut participer et signer l'appel à la convergence qui est vraiment à la base de lancement de cet événement ce soir et où on dit vraiment, il n'y a personne qui va lâcher la main de personne. Alors, merci beaucoup à vous tous. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.